Ah. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Roger Waldinger. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of International Migration at UCLA, professor of sociology, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's event. This is the fourth in our quarter-long series of book talks that we are undertaking in partnership with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego. I will introduce today's speaker in a moment, but let me first tell you that we have another talk scheduled for next Friday, same time, same place. The author is Adam Goodman, a historian who will talk about his new book, The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants. And there will be a comment by Toby Higbee, who's professor of history and labor studies at UCLA. So I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Fidan Elcioglu, who is assistant professor of sociology at the University of Toronto, and will talk about her new book, Divided by the Wall. Fidan will talk for roughly 20 minutes, give or take a couple of few, and then followed by a comment by Tom Medvetz, who is associate professor of sociology at UC San Diego. If you would please send me, what will happen is we'll have the presentation, then the comment, then Fidan will have a few minutes to reply to the questions raised by Tom, and then we will segue to discussion. So those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please send them to me by chat. Doing so earlier rather than later will be helpful so I can pull together questions and provide a steady feed to Fidan. So without further ado, Fidan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you to UCLA and UC San Diego for the invitation to be part of this wonderful series. And thank you to the audience for being here. I know this is a pretty anxiety-inducing time, especially for parents. So I'm grateful that you made the time in your day to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just one moment. All right. So I want to begin with a vignette about a 28-year-old white woman I call Gail. She's someone I met during ethnographic fieldwork in southern Arizona. Gail is, sorry. Okay. Gail is a member of a pro-immigrant organization that I refer to as the Humanitarians. As a member of the Humanitarians, she and her fellow volunteers hike deep into Arizona's Sonoran desert, where migrants cross and they leave out water. Gail recalled one of the first times she was in the desert with the Humanitarians. She and a fellow volunteer encountered three migrants, two young men and a woman, and they were siblings from Guatemala. The group was too tired to go on. Their feet were covered in blisters and they were severely dehydrated. While the humanitarians attended to their injuries, gave them food and water, the woman asked the American volunteers to call the U.S. Border Patrol. The siblings wanted to turn themselves in. Gail's colleague cautioned them gently. Migrants were abused in Border Patrol custody, even short term custody, she said. Were they sure they wanted to turn themselves in? Yes, said the woman firmly. Please call Border Patrol. Reluctantly, the humanitarians called the federal agency, and within a few hours, Border Patrol agents packed the family into their van and drove away. Now, in the very same regions that Americans like Gail distributed water, other Americans assembled to do armed patrols in the desert, find migrants, and turn them over to Border Patrol. One such group is an anti-immigrant organization that I call the Soldiers. Rick, a 57-year-old white man, was their leader. One winter morning, I am with the soldiers on one of their so-called operations in the desert. Two migrants, teenage boys, emerge from a dry riverbed. The soldiers' main Spanish speaker, Tommy, walks over, barking to see the contents of their backpacks. He finds the boys' IDs. He turns to Rick and says, "Hey, boss, these are minors." Rick grumbles sarcastically, "Oh, yay, they get to stay." He rolls his eyes. We learn that the younger boy is Guatemalan and his companion is Honduran. Rick tells them to sit by the campfire to stay warm, then walks away to call Border Patrol. Another soldier offers the boys water and food. We learn that the boys got separated from the group that they were traveling with and got lost. Wanting to turn themselves in, they had come over to the soldiers' campsite. Eventually, 2 Border Patrol agents arrive and they take the boys away. So, in putting these 2 vignettes side by side, I want to draw your attention to a few things. First, in both cases, the actions I describe are essentially identical. A group of American civilians encounter a group of Central American migrants in Arizona's Sonoran desert, give them food and water, and summon Border Patrol. Also, in both cases, the activists do not have a direct connection with the issue around which they mobilize. Despite their different worldviews, Gail and Rick and the other activists I spoke to were not personally impacted by U.S. immigration policies. Despite wanting to defend immigrants, Gail herself was not an immigrant, nor did she have any kin who were. Although he dedicated his desert operations to Americans who had died because of injuries allegedly inflicted by undocumented immigrants, Rick himself did not personally know anyone who was killed in this way. Activists like Gail and Rick share another characteristic. In both cases, activists knew that their efforts were not going to bring about the long-term change that they wanted. Gail knew that no matter how much water and humanitarian aid she helped put out in the desert, migrants would continue to die from dehydration and exposure to the elements. Rick knew that no matter how often he and his comrades patrolled the desert, he could never deter cross-border traffic of people and contraband. Despite the futility of their actions, however, Gail and Rick saw their mobilization as very meaningful. My goal was to explore those meanings. And specifically, my research was animated by 2 puzzling observations. First, why are citizens, who are predominantly white Americans, staking a claim in the immigration struggle in this way? And second, why are they mobilizing when they don't believe that their actions will make a difference? And what I will argue, and what I argue in the book, is that immigration politics is not just about immigration or immigrants. Immigration politics has become the go-to language for citizens to express their unease with inequality. There is obviously a lot of scholarship on American immigration politics, but to kind of sum it up, I found that sociologists interested in immigration politics tend to examine how groups mobilize, while ignoring why people mobilize, including their sort of ideas about society, their worldviews, and who these participants are in relation to social structures. And I'm happy to talk about my critique of the literature in the Q&A. But what I found is that I couldn't just focus on their social movement strategies. I also had to look at their political orientations, their ideologies, and I couldn't ignore activists' own positionalities. So in my research, political orientation was important for 2 reasons. First, ideology, and namely ideas about the state, shaped the strategies that organizations favored. And second, these ideas about the state were important also because they were profoundly meaningful at a personal level. This is because state-directed ideas and practices gave activists the tools to manage their own complex intersectional identities. I also noticed that the 2 sides were not only distinct political groups, but they were also distinct social groups. There was a class difference between pro-immigrant activists and the anti-immigrant activists that I met. Compared to their pro-immigrant opponents, anti-immigrant activists had less formal education, they had experienced downward social mobility, and they did not have a lot of choice in whether and how they were employed. Also, there was an important gender disparity across the 2 sides. Anti-immigrant organizations had a lot of men, while pro-immigrant organizations had a lot of women. Despite these differences, members of both sides grappled with a tension in their identity. And I detected two kinds of tensions. The main preoccupation among pro-immigrant activists was the tension between their progressive worldview and their privileged backgrounds. A progressive but privileged subjectivity was plagued by the sense that privilege came with a moral obligation to help less fortunate others. Their right-wing restrictionist counterparts struggled with being white but working class, or the disparity between their in-group status as white men and the diminishing sense of control that accompanied downward social mobility. What made white but working class a troubled identity was the idea that in order to be a good or competent white man, one could not be or feel precarious. I also realized that pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant activists talked about state power very differently. Pro-immigrant activists saw the state as extremely powerful and dangerously competent. Their opponents, meanwhile, saw the state as emasculated and dangerously incompetent. So in this image that I'm showing on the slide, it's that gap between the end of the fence and then the vehicle barrier. This was an image that got circulated among anti-immigrant activists quite often. People would actually do a pilgrimage to that site and take photographs of themselves crossing over to Mexico and back again. So empowering an emasculated state bolstered restrictionist or anti-immigrant activist claims on white masculinity, whereas weakening the state offered pro-immigrant activists an opportunity to do or perform white femininity. I find that immigration politics has become an arena in which white people can carry out projects of self-affirmation as they cope with the effects of inequality. Although activists wanted to see a change in the world, what sustained their mobilization was the fact that their participation allowed them to experience a change in themselves. So my work draws on almost 20 months of participant observation. I actually studied 5 organizations, but in this talk, I'm just going to talk about 2 of them. I'm happy to talk about the other ones in the Q&A if there's interest. I want to say also a few words to set the historical context of my field sites. In the early 1990s, the federal government adopted a border enforcement scheme that basically funneled migrants towards Arizona's Sonoran border, where many perished on their journey north. And in order to sort of navigate this harsh terrain, migrants ended up paying these steep fees to professional smugglers to guide them through the dangerous terrain. And drug trafficking organizations worked their way into this growing market. So Southern Arizona, and specifically the places where Gail and Rick were, became really important points of unauthorized entry into the U.S. And so just want to set that context, and I'm happy to talk more about this border enforcement regime in the Q&A too, if there are any questions. So in this talk, I'm going to specifically focus on Gail and Rick, who were the 2 people that I introduced this talk with. And the reason why I focus on them is because they really exemplify a lot of the characteristics I found on either side. So let's start with Gail, who, as I mentioned before, was a 28-year-old white woman who I met in Arizona and who's a member of this organization called the Humanitarians. So Gail grew up in an all-white suburb of Ohio. Both of her parents were university-educated professionals. Gail herself also attended university, and later, after graduating, she traveled through Europe and South America. But more than any of these experiences, she told me that it was a friendship with a coworker at a bakery that was instrumental in shaping her political consciousness. This coworker was originally from Honduras, And as far as Gail was concerned, the two young women were equals, just two friends working at this bakery. But that illusion of equality vanished one day when Immigration and Customs Enforcement raided the bakery and took away Gail's friend. And in an instant, Gail realized she realized the vastly different life opportunities that she and her friend had. Gail lost touch with her friend, but the experience of agents taking that friend away stuck with her. And so after she finished her studies and traveled, Gail decided to move to Washington, D.C., where she began working at a nonprofit organization that advocated for immigrant rights. Soon, however, she began grappling with her privilege again. Her position of power became visible to Gail when her organization started working on a class action lawsuit on behalf of asylum seekers. The lawsuit aimed to make asylum seekers eligible for work visas while they waited for final decisions on their cases. This way, asylum seekers who were trying to make ends meet would not risk their asylum case if they got caught working illegally. Gail was tasked with finding plaintiffs who would make this lawsuit compelling. So here's how she talks about that moment in her life. So I'm this middle-class white person. I know how the courts are going to view the most or least vulnerable people. We want this Nigerian woman who's protecting her daughter from female genital mutilation, but the Honduran dude is escaping violence. Nah, he's fucking gang. I'm this young person making these decisions. It's a game and we won. That affects a lot of people. I realized I don't feel good in this position. They do incredible work, the organization in DC, but just made me realize that I didn't want to work on things in this broad-based way. So as soon as the case was over, Gail quit her job and Gail left DC. She moved to Arizona to become a full-time unpaid volunteer with the humanitarians. And so as I was trying to figure out Gail's story, I asked her, well, how is Arizona different from Washington, D.C.? And here's what she said. She said, being out here in the desert, there's that direct human thing. If we change this one policy that will affect all these people, I value that, and that's really important. But having an actual human in front of you and being like, what do we need to do to get you where you need to go? That's meaningful. So Gail, in other words, assigned more meaning to the singular act of giving water to a migrant in the desert than to a large-scale effort to improve the lives of 3 million asylum seekers. This is a remarkable rationale. And it made me realize that her activism was driven not by its actual outcomes, but by the pursuit to answer grating questions about morality and positionality. How can I be progressive, but white, middle class, and poised for a life of material comfort? Again and again, I realized that this dilemma was what framed pro-immigrant activists' stories about themselves. So what exactly was it about the border that helped Gail and other pro-immigrant activists cope with this identity? Taking water out into the desert at its most fundamental level allowed Gail to use her privilege to weaken the state. This is how Gail put it. Every time a person makes it to their destination in the US, in spite of all the state power that is ensuring that they don't make it, that one person making it and anyone helping them along the way, that feels like a privilege to feel useful in some way. The fact that Gail could help someone in spite of all the state power gave her unparalleled satisfaction. And this satisfaction stemmed from how Gail and other pro-immigrant activists understood the state. In this worldview, the US state was a powerful anti-hero. Racialized migrants were its helpless victims. And when migrants crossed the border, activists told me, they did so involuntarily. If human agency was conceptualized as a spectrum, migrants were on one end, while white middle-class Americans were on the opposite end. So for this group of activists, privilege really felt like an impediment in the pursuit of allyship. But at the border, there was an opportunity to exploit one's privilege in order to weaken the state and help migrants. Instead of being progressive but privileged, one could be progressive and privileged. So now I want to move on to Rick, who we also met earlier. He's the leader of the Soldiers, which is a Minutemen-type anti-immigration group that I studied. Rick told me that his interest in immigration politics began on a particular day in late 2008 when he realized that his world was falling apart. That day, Rick went to work. His job, he explained, was to build high rises. He had been in the construction business for nearly 3 decades. I was the guy who they handed the blueprint this thick 6 months before the building even came out of the ground. My job was to study this thing and to write letters to architects, engineers, and plumbers. Why are we doing it this way? So that by the time we were ready to go, we'd be ready to go. It was a lot of responsibility, and I thrived on it. But on that fateful day in 2008, Rick was laid off. And when he lost his job, Rick was 48 years old. He was a Marine Corps veteran and a college dropout. He did not have skill sets outside of construction. Rick said he went from making $80,000 a year to $12,000 on unemployment. He lost his home. His wife divorced him. He began living out of his car. He started drinking after years of sobriety. His life felt like it was spiraling out of control. In the years that followed, Rick could never get back up on his feet. He began connecting the dots in his head. Maybe the reason he was having such a hard time was because there was an endless supply of, quote, illegal aliens who were willing to accept low wages and outcompete him in the market. Going to the border was a way for Rick to regain control over his life. He wanted to do rather than be done to. When I was with Rick on a so-called operation, there were 7 people. But just with those 7 people, he said, I've closed about 5 miles of some of the cartel's best smuggling corridors. Gesturing at the mountains behind him, Rick continued, look at this train. It's nothing but mountains. The drug cartel wants to be in this mountainous terrain where they can hide, so we force them into the flatter areas where it's easier to be caught by Border Patrol. So just as with pro-immigrant activism, I realized that the actual impact of their mobilization was questionable. After all, the soldiers' efforts may have forced the smugglers to move, but it would be hard to argue that they actually deterred anyone from trying to cross the border. I asked Rick, was this a pointless effort? He responded gruffly, then I guess I'll die here. Everybody makes a choice in life about what they do. He added, agents will stop in and ask what you got. They love us because we're helping them do their job. I'm more at peace here than I've ever been in my life. So how do we make sense of someone like Rick? Well, he had overcome big challenges: unemployment, loss of a home, divorce, substance addiction. And through it all, he was plagued by a visceral sense of marginalization. Rick was socialized in a country where men like him had material and symbolic advantages over everyone else. The wages of whiteness created a set of expectations about who society should celebrate and reward. But the structural pressure of class made it feel like he was being deprived of his birthright. Rick was devastated, confused. To be white but working class meant feeling like he was owed power, but powerless to do anything about being denied that power. Being on the border helped Rick assume a sense of control. While pro-immigrant respondents saw migrants as victims, anti-immigrant activists saw them as victimizers, emboldened by a weak line of defense. According to Rick, migration persisted because there were simply not enough Border Patrol agents amassed at the U.S. Mexico boundary. The soldiers' tactics were shaped by this analysis. The group organized round-the-clock stakeouts within a mile of the international boundary and then shared this intel with Border Patrol. This state-strengthening activism gave Rick a sense of purpose. It counteracted the deprivation that he otherwise felt in his white but working-class life. So Gail, Rick, and the other activists I studied desperately wanted to change the rules of immigration, but immigration policy did not always personally affect them. And they were uncertain about that their collective action would bring about the change that they wanted. So for me, the question was, well, what sustained this participation? What I learned was that the relationship between participants' identities and the organization's state-directed mobilization was really important. I realized that the act of mobilizing was saturated with meanings that went far beyond immigration policy. Immigration politics was a highly symbolic struggle wherein the integrity of citizen participants' identities were at stake. Yes, people like Gail and Rick wanted to change the distribution of power in society, but their mobilization was also about self-transformation in a context of deepening inequality. What kept people engaged was the conviction that their action was also helping them alter the imbalance of power between themselves and the rest of society. When my respondents tried to make sense of who belonged, they were simultaneously concerned about how and whether they belonged. In other words, immigration politics is not just a struggle around whether to include or exclude the racialized non-citizen other, it's also a struggle to figure out how white citizen selves fit into a stratified society. It is a way to deal with the problem of being American, but anxious. As sociologists of migration, we need to be aware of this phenomenon. We need to ask ourselves, what do political struggles about them reveal about us? So what does this all mean? My research suggests that in order to diffuse the contentiousness of immigration policy, we need to think about and address growing social inequality. This inequality is fostering misery, anxiety, and uncertainty across the socioeconomic spectrum, including among those who are ostensibly secure citizen members. Staking a claim in immigration politics has become a way to articulate other concerns. And as sociologists of migration, we need to ask, what are those other concerns? How is the contention about immigration obscuring other larger social problems that are connected to capitalism, to white supremacy, to imperialism? And we cannot address these problems exclusively by altering immigration policy, and certainly not by relying on the same kinds of narrowly conceived policy changes that have been used in the past. Thank you.
Terrific. Okay, thank you so much, Fidan. All right, Tom, do you want to proceed with the comment?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Fidan. I'm very happy for the chance to comment on this fantastic book. Divided by the Wall is a brilliant study of the politics of immigration in the US, but as you just heard, its focus is not specifically on policy battles or policy outcomes. Instead, it is about a particular subset of both pro-immigrant and restrictionist activists and the grassroots organizations that they're affiliated with. These activists are overwhelmingly white, conscience constituents, meaning that most of them have no direct personal stake in the immigration issue. As a rule, they also favor, as you heard, more direct forms of political action, like leaving water in the desert for migrants to find, or on the other side of the issue, setting up camera traps or dispatching drones to detect illegal border crossings. So the book is concerned with the question of why these Southern Arizona activists invest so much of their time and their energy into a set of practices that are not likely to benefit them or their loved ones directly, and also that are, by their own admission, very limited in their effectiveness. Now, I think for my money, one of the most distinctive things about the study is that it places the left and the right-wing activists on the same analytic plane, meaning that for large parts of the book, the ideological differences between them are effectively bracketed so that a series of structural similarities can be revealed. One of those similarities is that both sets of activists are said to be motivated by some kind of deep interior conflict. And the book calls these conflictual identities. So on the pro-immigrant side, the conflict in question comes from being both progressive and privileged, whereas for the restrictionists, the tension lies in the combination of being both white and downwardly mobile. So the book argues that these two conflictual identities in turn coincide with different projections of state power, which themselves yield different repertoires of activism. So more specifically, the pro-immigrant activists see the state as a powerful, oppressive agent. And it's in this context that the act of leaving water in the desert becomes a kind of subversive attempt to chip away at the state's power. On the other side, the restrictionists, as we heard, project onto the state this image of the emasculated male, woefully sort of limited in his or its capacity and therefore in need of assistance. And so it's in this context that putting on makeshift camouflage uniforms and patrolling the border for migrants becomes a source of self-affirmation. In that case, I read the relationship between the restrictionists and the state as not unlike that between an alcoholic and his AA sponsor, right? The activist is feeling down and out and helps himself by helping someone else who has essentially the same problem. But for both sets of activists on the left and the right, the activism works as a vehicle of personal redemption. So as you can intuit, there are so many things to admire about Divided by the Wall. First of all, the book offers truly one of the most empirically rich portraits of political activism that you'll be likely to find in any academic study. Secondly, it's distinctive for its very novel analytic approach, which I would tentatively, at the risk of exaggeration, label a socio-psychoanalytic approach for a few reasons. One is that the author is unusually attentive to the interior lives of the research subjects, not only their motives, but also how their prior experiences have shaped the mental constructs that they use to understand the cross-border immigration issue. And so the result is this very sensitive portrait of the social roots of activism on each side of the issue. This requires a very delicate and painstaking kind of analysis, and also a recognition of the supreme complexity of human thought. It requires the author to listen very carefully, not only to what these respondents are saying, but to what is implied in their words and to the underlying logic of their actions. Now, all of these virtues add up to an additional virtue, which is that while the study is concerned with the usual topics of social movement research, it's also unbound by the sometimes confining categories of that literature. So the familiar concerns with things like mobilization tactics and opportunity structures are dealt with here, but in a very novel and refreshing way. The author shows a real talent for thinking outside of these categories. And finally, it's worth noting that Divided by the Wall is very well written and well organized, making it a pleasure to read. I do want to register one light critique. As I was reading the book, just to begin with, I couldn't help but engage in my own form of socio-psychoanalysis. I should mention that the author and I don't know each other personally, but I think we share the same conflictual identity, if I were to speculate, owing to our common status as products of the Berkeley Sociology Department. What's the conflict? Well, it's the conflict that springs from the experience of being trained in an American department that nonetheless imagines itself as a headquarters of European-style social theorizing. Now, I would point out that in most contexts, this can be a real asset, especially when you're dealing with sociologists who insist that data can somehow speak for themselves. On the other hand, this identity also carries certain dangers. One of them is the temptation to, at times, elevate the pristine theoretical model over the messiness of real life. Now, I see this tension in my own work, and I think I recognize it too in Divided by the Wall. It should be clear that this book has an extraordinary theoretical elegance to it. I think there are occasions, though, when not very much is gained and maybe something is even lost from some of the theoretical and conceptual sophistication. So as an example, take the idea of the conflictual identity, which really takes center stage in the book and ends up tasked with doing a lot of the analytic heavy lifting. By the way, I think it's quite telling and paradoxically reinforces this point that the concept didn't come up in this talk. And my argument would be nothing much is lost in leaving it out. Because central as it is to the book, I don't think the concept actually contributes much to the analysis for the simple reason that each conflictual identity refers to a conflict that arises only in relation to some prior commitment held by the activists. So the restrictionists, for them, the tension derives from the experience of being white and downwardly mobile. Clearly, though, some downwardly mobile whites will not experience that identity or that combination as a conflict. It becomes a conflict against or in relation to some prior expectation about the rightful place of whites in American society. And so that's what we want to know. How did that conflict emerge for these particular activists? Likewise, the pro-immigrant activists are said to grapple with the conflict of being progressive but privileged. But once again, that's a conflict only in relation to a very particular understanding of what it means to be progressive. So my point is that the idea of a conflictual identity really pushes the burden of explanation to a different level. We want to know more about how these conflicts formed. And if you listen to the talk and if you read Divided by the Wall, you can see that this is a very light critique indeed, because the book does provide much of this analysis. I think it's just obscured by the conceptual apparatus. In the case of the pro-immigrant activists profiled in chapter 2 of the book, for example, the key point seems to be that all of them in the course of pursuing an advanced formal education have had some kind of profound awakening experience, one that left them feeling disillusioned about politics and about their place in the social order. So in each case, the point is that this experience seems to have been precipitated by some encounter with a non-American culture or with the social sciences, interestingly. Now, the last issue I'd like to raise is that I would also like to have learned a little bit more from the book about the wider landscape of immigration activism in Southern Arizona. The author addresses this concern in the appendix, but to my mind, the key issue remains unexplored. So I would say the issue is not how representative the respondent sample is, which is what the author talks about in the appendix, but rather how best to put into context the peculiar breed of activism that this study describes. In my view, this is really the most notable achievement of this study. It sheds light on a phenomenon that I would call therapeutic activism, right? Very strikingly, as we've been told, many of the figures in this book have been involved previously in forms of mobilization that by their own accounts were more effective than their preferred tactics today. Nowadays, though, they're less interested in boring things like legal advocacy or voter persuasion or anything that doesn't really help them work through the internal dilemmas that the author talks about. This raises a series of very important questions, and many of them are normative questions. First and foremost, is therapeutic activism selfish? Is it better than no activism at all? Is it a form of symbolic politics that does little to advance the cause of a wider movement? Broadly speaking, what effects do therapeutic activists have on the movements that they're affiliated with? Should they, in every case, defer to activists who do have a personal stake in the policy issue? These sorts of questions might fall, strictly speaking, outside the purview of most social movements research, but they also have a direct bearing on other very current political struggles, including the relationship between Black Lives Matter activists and their white allies. So I think it's to the author's distinct credit that Divided by the Wall raises these questions and raises them in the most interesting, thought-provoking, and empirically vivid way possible. So my main takeaway is that I look forward to the scholarly and hopefully civic debates that this book is very likely to generate. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, Tom, thank you so much for so careful and so insightful a comment. So Fidan, do you want to respond quickly? And we have already a number of people who have sent me questions, so I would like to proceed. Yes, Tom.
May I add one thing very quickly, and that is I want to note that only this morning, I believe, did I see that Fidan was going to have to respond to my comments. And so I was not able to get her a version of my comments. She had not seen them beforehand. So normally I would not want to respond under those circumstances.
Fidan, you have to unmute.
Tom, I just want to thank you for these wonderful comments. They're so, they're really thought-provoking and very generous. I love the concept of therapeutic activism. I wish I had gotten the manuscript to you before it was published. That's a great concept. And the questions you ask about sort of what is the role of therapeutic activism in political struggle, especially in this moment where everything is so explosive, I think is a really important question, and it's something that I want to think about more. Since we don't have a whole lot of time, I'll just let the audience speak. But thank you again, Tom. I really appreciate all the wonderful comments.
Terrific. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to begin with, I'm going to put together two related questions. One sent me by Andrew Lee and the other by Marilyn. And they both make the point that in your presentation, we see a reversal of the usual stance associated with the ideology of these activists. On the one hand, you have the pro-immigration activists who are calling for a weaker state, but typically liberals, progressives want a stronger state. And you have then the restrictionists who are calling for a stronger state, but usually they want a weaker state. So how do you explain that apparent contradiction, and to what extent are the participants aware of it? And to what extent do they deal with it? Or how do they if they're aware of the contradiction, how do they explain it?
That's a great question. I think the activists, the pro-immigrant activists that I studied would not want to be classified as liberal. And similarly, on the other side, they're very critical actually of Republicans. And in fact, have this great critique. They call them rhinos, Republicans in name only. The idea that to be a really true Republican, one needs to take a different stance than what the RNC does. Yes, absolutely. That's an interesting sort of difference than sort of what we would expect. And the way I explain it is because they're fixated on a particular part of the state, the so-called, I guess it would be the right hand of the state, the coercive aspect of the state. So they're specifically concerned about the deportation machine, the deportation apparatus that targets immigrants and racialized communities. Actually, in some ways, the current calls for defunding the police, abolitionism, etc., those are more in line with what the pro-immigrant activists I studied, what their worldview is, rather than sort of a liberal understanding.
Okay, so I would like to come back to that, but let me, we have hold on a second. Okay, so one question from Alison Norton: what challenge did you face? A methodological question: what challenge did you face in gaining access to and building trust with the people you studied?
I have a whole methodological appendix about that. Well, I'll just say that when I first started the field work, I expected that I would have a really hard time accessing the right and a really easy time accessing the left. But it actually turned out to be the reverse. For really unexpected reasons. And I talk about this a little bit in the appendix because of sort of internal tensions that were going on in the groups that I was studying. They were either welcoming or not welcoming towards me. I think, I think more interest maybe to this audience is, how do you study the right? How do you, access these spaces that, especially, and remember, I went into this as a Berkeley graduate student. So as soon as I opened my mouth and said, I'm from California, not only that, I'm from UC Berkeley, eyebrows got raised. But I think, I think there was a genuine sort of interest and curiosity about who I was and like why I was so interested in them. And there was also the gender thing, and that was really key. Walking in as a younger woman among a lot of older men, racially ambiguous, not fitting into any clear category. But also having this American accent and, being able to speak like an American, I was a curiosity. And I think that actually worked to my advantage. People, a lot of these right-wing activists, some of them were just outright suspicious of my intentions and didn't want to talk to me, and there was nothing I could do. But a lot of them said, you remind me of my niece, you remind me of my daughter, you remind me of my granddaughter. And they would sort of enjoy, for instance, when I accompanied them into the desert, because they felt like they were protecting me, from all the sort of, the drug cartels or all the dangers of the desert. So that kind of gendered protectionism actually worked to my advantage and allowed me to access groups that I didn't expect to access very easily. And there were still a lot of challenges. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do at all. Any ethnography is really difficult. Accessing any field is very difficult.
Okay, excellent. A question from David Fitzgerald. Could you clarify the claim that the activists were not directly affected by immigration? This would seem to apply to progressives, but not the restrictionists. The latter apparently believed and represented himself as having been thrown out of the middle class by the effects of immigration. Whether his perceptions are accurate or not was the puzzle of why he participates. And I guess I would expand that, and that is to say that everyone is affected by immigration. Immigration is transforming the society. So whether or not there are immediate personal impacts, is it appropriate or meaningful to argue that somehow or another this is somehow incidental? That is, it's not a response to the overall societal impact of immigration.
Absolutely, that's a really important point. The way I would respond to it is in this way, and I totally agree with this point, by the way, but this is how I would respond to it. First, I think it is important to differentiate between groups that are directly impacted and those that are not. And in fact, the social movement literature does a lot of this. And, one could say, an attack on one group is an attack on all, that kind of thing. But the pro-immigrant groups that I studied actually used this framing. I mean, I got this framing from them because they would say, they would differentiate their own groups from immigrant-led groups, and they would talk about how they were not personally impacted, i.e., if they ran into Border Patrol, yes, they would be a little bit scared, but they wouldn't be so scared that they might suddenly, never see their family again. So that that threat of deportation is obviously very specific to a particular population. And so what I'm trying to emphasize in this book is that this group doesn't, at least with this group is kind of immune to that immediate threat of deportation. On the right, yes, one could make the argument, that the saturation of undocumented labor in the labor market is going to affect people like Rick. And certainly he's making some of those connections in his head, although they're much more hazy. But the way that they mobilize is not around, let's get employers to stop hiring undocumented people. The way that he mobilizes is, we're going to have this militarized operation in the desert, and it's going to be dedicated to the people who died because they, were, murdered by an undocumented person. But he himself does not know doesn't know anyone like that, and that's not his personal tragedy. So that's what I meant by sort of classifying this group as conscious constituents as opposed to, people who are directly impacted. But absolutely, you're right. Immigration policy affects everyone, including citizens, right? Because the whole premise is, figuring out, the boundary between citizenship and non-citizenship, and that boundary changes over time, right? So I think that's a very valid critique.
Okay, a question from Grace Young. Do you see it as being appropriate for privileged people who don't have any direct stake in immigration to voluntarily play a role in shaping it? In a way, this picks up on what you've just been talking about. So the normal people are like Rick and Gail. If so, what role do you see them playing?
I mean, I don't want to make a normative argument one way or the other. I think it goes back to Tom's comment about therapeutic politics. I think there is a lot of that happening. I think that, if I'm thinking about these groups or if I'm thinking about, the humanitarians, my main critique of the humanitarians would be they're completely, disconnected from the immigrant-led immigrant rights movement, right? So they think that they're doing good, and they think that this is the pathway that they should take, but they're not really consulting with, with immigrant-led groups, whether it's the Dreamers or whomever. So, I mean, I don't know. I think as a rule of thumb, I think the directly affected groups should be the vanguard of any movement.
Okay. A question from Jennifer Perignac. Your research highlights the compelling and contradictory nature of personal motivation and desire with action and how this is framed and negotiated on an individual basis. I'm curious about whether the specific action of physically inserting themselves in the desert brought this to an elevated level of analysis, excuse me, an elevated level of analysis for you as a researcher.
So just if I can reword that question, is it, how does ethnography allow me to
Well, the question is really about the kind of embodied nature of the embodied nature in that specific environmental context.
Yeah.
What any specificity of that related to those two characteristics?
Yes, so I think definitely, I think Loic Wacant has a great term for it, which I can't think of it, but carnal ethnography. It really felt like carnal ethnography. And I would say that if I had just done interviews and, interviews in nice air conditioned, libraries or in my house or whatever, I don't know if I would have gotten at the same sort of analysis, because part of it was just how much I suffered personally, like physically suffered when I was in the desert. And so I'm not, I think the desert is a really beautiful place. And I think Arizona is like a geographically and ecosystem wide, it's beautiful, but I would never seek out to go out in the desert and camp there and, expose myself to the extreme heat, then the extreme cold, and like all of that made me realize that this is really hard, like this is really hard what these people are doing, what they're exposing their bodies to. So, why are they doing this? Especially given the fact that they also, admit that it might not be very effective, right? So, I mean, they're in itself that sort of ethnographic moment of, why are people suffering so much for something that, it's uncertain whether it's going to even have any type of effect in the direction that they want. Then, that was sort of a key moment for me.
Okay, I just want to return for a moment. I guess, take the privilege of asking the last question. That is to come back to the issue of of ideology. I mean, there a large literature in the politics of immigration emphasizes that one of the distinctive characteristics, in a way, the salient characteristics of politics of immigration, that it creates these ideological cleavages within the left and within the right. So that you have the right divided between more ideologically consistent libertarian view, such as that espoused by the Wall Street Journal in its better days, open borders, and on the other hand, the social conservatives like Rick, whom you described, and on the other hand, immigrant rights groups versus, let's say, labor unions. So I'm just wondering, how could you tell us a little bit more about how these persons understood themselves ideologically? And I mean, it's one thing to say I'm not a rhino, or that I don't share the politics of the Wall Street Journal, but what were their politics, and how did they did they have any appreciation, let's say on the right, for the tension between a kind of core right-wing value, that in freedom, and their defense of greater state power?
Yes, that's a really good, important question. You're right that it does sort of highlight the cleavages on both sides, right? Rather than sort of showcasing the moment of consensus on either side. I guess the way I would answer is by talking a little bit about the relationship, the tenuous and tense relationship between the activists that I studied, the right-wing activists, and the Tea Party. So, when I was conducting my research, this was really when the Tea Party was, becoming a big movement. There were, tea parties being held, during tax day or whatever. And, when I went into the field, I expected that, these gatherings of Tea Party groups would also be the place where I would find people like Rick. But it actually turned out to not be the case. So people like Rick had a lot of sympathy for the Tea Party, but they would say things like, well, they're not really doing anything, right? So I'm glad. So he would say things like, the Tea Party is a sort of I mean, I'm summarizing what he's saying, but it's an important critique of the sort of the rhinos, right? But at the same time, the Tea Party is not necessarily doing anything, right? Like they're gathering together in in public libraries and reading the Constitution, so what, you know? So there was still this kind of tension between the main conservative movement at the time and the activists that I was studying. And it was sort of, and it was something that I only realized when I, went to Tea Party groups and realized that there weren't the activists that I expected to be there. I don't know if that sort of answers some of that question, but Trump, right? I asked them. So when I returned to the field, it was shortly after Trump had assumed office, and I asked Rick. I said, he had voted for Trump, but I asked him, what do you expect? And he said, well, we don't know. At the end of the day, he's a politician, right? So there's definitely also this disconnect, not only between like us conservatives and the sort of, or us activists and the sort of conservative movement, but there's also a disconnect between us at the grassroots level on the front lines, in Arizona, in the desert, versus these, politicians in DC, right, in the swamp. So there's also that kind of tension.
Okay. All right. Well, terrific. All right. So I'm afraid we have come to the end of our time, but I know we have such a rich book that we could continue for longer, but alas, we must stop. So thank you very much, Fidan, for a terrific presentation, and Tom for such an insightful comment. Thanks to everybody who has joined us, and a reminder that we will reassemble same time, same place, so to speak, next Friday at noon for a book presentation by Adam Goodman on the deportation machine, and a comment by Toby Higbee. Okay, everybody, have a great weekend. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you. Thanks.